66 million years ago, a kingdom stretched across a world we would barely recognize. Rivers carved through forests of ancient conifers. Fog rose from floodplains that had never known the sound of a human voice. Here, in what we now call Hell Creek, life moved at its own rhythm. And on this morning, nothing suggested it would ever end. Triceratops were among the last of the great ceratoxins. Three-horned giants that moved in family groups across the flood banks. Each adult carried a skull nearly a third of its body length, crowned with horns worn by years of use. They moved slowly, deliberately, through a landscape they had shaped with their own weight. For millions of years, this rhythm had not changed. Edmontosaurus moved in herds that could stretch across a floodplain. Hundreds of animals, pressing forward through mud and shallow water. Each adult weighed as much as a truck, yet they traveled together with a caution that betrayed their place in the food chain. Even in numbers, they were never truly safe. Somewhere beyond the mist, something was always watching. At the forest edge, something moved differently from the herds. Tyrannosaurus rex, 9 tons of bone, muscle, and instinct, walking a territory it had claimed through years of dominance. It did not chase. It watched. It waited. It read the landscape like a map of opportunity. Patience was its greatest weapon. Every crossing was a risk. The river was shallow, but the mud was deep, and the current disguised the worst of it. The herds had no choice. The flood burned on the other side held fresh growth, and hunger outweighed fear. Tons of muscle and bone pushed through water that fought every step. On the far bank, the mud released them slowly, as if the river did not want to let go. In the rainforests of the late Cretaceous, armor could mean the difference between life and death. The predators were smaller, faster, and impatient, but this was no easy target. One mistake, and the hunter becomes the injured. The warning was enough. Against armor like this, speed alone could not win. No. Deep in the forest, away from the herds and the predators, Blythe began in silence. Each egg held a future that had taken millions of years to shape. The young emerged into a world that demanded everything from them immediately: strength, instinct, and the protection of adults who would not leave their side. For now, the nest was safe. For now, the forest was quiet. When the sun dropped below the conifers, Hell Creek did not sleep. In the spaces between the giants, smaller lives moved through the dark. Mammals no larger than a hand, navigating a world built for creatures 1,000 times their size. Even in darkness, the largest predator on the continent did not rest. By morning, the storms would pass. But morning would bring something no animal in this forest had ever seen. That morning, something in the air had changed. The herd sensed it before any eye could see it. Across the floodplain, animals that had grazed for hours without lifting their heads began to look upward. A light appeared in the southern sky. Faint at first, no brighter than a star. But it moved, and it grew. No animal in Hell Creek had a name for what was coming. No instinct had prepared them for this. The morning came as it always had. Grey light spreading across the floodbank, mist rising from the water, and the herds beginning to move. Triceratops lowered their horns into the firs. Edmontosaurus pressed forward through shallow water. At the forest edge, something enormous watched them go. This was the world as it had been for millions of years, complete, ancient, and unaware of its own ending. This was the last morning of the kingdom. The light in the southern sky was no longer faint. It was growing, brighter than anything the animals had ever seen. 10 kilometers wide, traveling at 20 kilometers per second, the asteroid had crossed the solar system in silence. Every animal on the floodplain had stopped. Herds that had never paused stood frozen, heads raised towards something beyond instinct. In seconds, it would reach the Gulf. In minutes, the world they knew would cease to exist. At 11:18 in the morning, the asteroid struck the shallow seas of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. The energy released was 10 billion times greater than the bomb that fell on Hiroshima. Rock, water, and atmosphere were vaporized in an instant. A crater 180 kilometers wide opened in the Earth's crust. The shockwave expanded at the speed of sound. "3,000 kilometers to the north, the animals of Hill Creek had less than an hour before the sky turned to fire. Within an hour, the thermal pulse arrived, a wave of heat that crossed the continent at the speed of light, raising temperatures beyond anything flesh could survive. Superheated glass sphericals, ejected into the upper atmosphere by the impact, began to rain down across North America. The sky itself became an oven. Forests that had stood for thousands of years ignited from the top down. The fire did not spread. It appeared everywhere at once. Behind the heat came the dust. A wall of displaced atmosphere carrying the shattered remains of the Yucatan seabed across the continent. Within days, the dust and ash had blocked the sun. Temperatures dropped. Photosynthesis slowed and stopped. The plants that fed the herbivores began to die. The survivors wandered through a landscape they no longer recognized, gray, cold, and stripped of everything they needed. The predators still moved through the dead forest, but there was nothing left to hunt. Hunger would finish what the impact had started. Beneath the ash, in the dark, something small was still breathing. The kingdom of the dinosaurs did not end in a single day. It ended in silence. Weeks, months, seasons, without sunlight, without growth, without the sounds that had filled the forests for 160 million years. But beneath the ash, in burrows barely wider than a fist, the smallest animals held on. They ate seeds, insects, and roots. They survived on almost nothing. The last of the great dinosaurs disappeared without ceremony. No final roar, no last stand. Just stillness where there had once been thunder. The world that came after would belong to those who had survived by being small, by being hidden, by being overlooked. The age of mammals had begun.